Week 12 is here, and this is where running backs start separating the real contenders from the pretenders. Roles are settling, workloads matter more than ever, and a few surprise breakouts are flipping leagues on their heads. Let's break down which running backs you can trust headed into the home stretch with your quick and dirty top 30. What's up, Headliner Nation? My name is Brad, the Rankings King, and before we dive into this week's rankings, just a reminder that these are the consensus rankings from the Headliners team. And for more detailed analysis, check out the start-sit videos from Kyle already posted this week. If you want even more breakdowns each week, join the Fantasy Headliners community by hitting that join button below. That's going to get you access to extra rankings like flex, kicker, defense, and a spot inside of our Discord. Now, before we jump into week 12, we have a few hits and misses from week number 11. Our first hit is Kyren Williams, and he continues to be ranked as a Verge top 12 guy weekly, and he continues to return top 12 value on the regular. And what about Chase Brown? The hot streak continued with Flacco under center. We had him at RB15, and he finished right at RB15. And then what about Derrick Henry? Despite the lower overall ceiling this year and the tough matchup against Cleveland, we kept him higher in the rankings, and he finished at RB7. All right, well, you know we're an honest channel, and so what about our misses? And we start with Travis Etienne. We saw the potential for a good week last week, but the 2 touchdowns really boosted him higher than expected. And then what about Kenneth Walker? And everybody stay calm, but we finally had a good week from Kenneth Walker to third, and to no one's surprise, he was ranked lower coming into last week. And then what about Sean Tucker? Outproducing Rachaad White. That wasn't so much a surprise, but 140 total yards and 2 touchdowns was, so we had him way too low in week 11. All right, let's turn the page to week 12, and we'll start in tier 1 with Christian McCaffrey, Jahmyr Gibbs, Bijan Robinson, Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Travion Henderson, and Rico Dowdle. Topping the list at number 1, we have Christian McCaffrey, and CMC has been a 49er for years, but this is his first chance at a revenge game against his former team. McCaffrey has scored 30-plus fantasy points in 3 of his last 5 games, and you better believe he's going to be trying for another one this week. At number 2, we have Jahmyr Gibbs, and Gibbs has 140-plus yards now in 3 of his last 4 games. It looks like he's playing at a different speed over the last month. It's clear that the volume will be there weekly, and he'll have a chance at a great game against an average Saints defense this week. At number 3, we have Bijan Robinson, and for the rest of the season, we have some serious concerns about Bijan. Without London and Penix, opposing teams could stack the box to stop the run and force Cousins to beat them with minimal weapons. The Giants, though, they do allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to running backs, and so we keep Bijan at number 3. At 4, we've got Jonathan Taylor, and the RB1 overall in fantasy football is coming off the bye and immediately into a tough matchup against Kansas City, who has been next to impossible to run on over the last 6 weeks. He's definitely going to need a touchdown this week. At 5, we have Saquon Barkley, and Saquon has been such a headache this season. He's now scored single-digit fantasy points in 3 of his last 5. On paper, this seems like it would be a great matchup against Dallas, but their defense will be much better than the one that he faced back in week 1. And at number 6, we have Derrick Henry. And now, obviously, the touchdowns are down, but what's more concerning is the fact that he hasn't had a run of at least 15 yards in 6 of his 10 games this season. The big plays just have not been there. Luckily, though, the Jets allow over 21 fantasy points per game to running backs, so he's locked in here at tier 1. At number 7, we've got Travion Henderson, and the floodgates have finally opened. 27-plus fantasy points in back-to-back games, and at this point, he's earned a larger role even if Stevenson were healthy. No team allows more fantasy points per game to running backs than Cincinnati, and so let's hope that Stevenson sits again. And at number 8, we got Rico Dowdle, and Rico is currently the RB10 overall and has only scored single-digit points 1 time since week 5. This game depends on which Carolina defense shows up, though, and it's a game script deal. If they can keep the game close, Dowdle should produce once again. All right, that's it for tier 1, and before we head into the next tier, I want to make sure that you're all set up on Underdog. You already know that we've been crushing those player pick'ems on Underdog this year, so what are you waiting for? Head over to Underdog Fantasy or download the app. Create a new account using the referral code Headliners when you do so. Then it's just to make your initial deposit and come join a contest. If you sign up with that promo code, again, it's Headliners. 49ers, you'll get access to all of the promos that Underdog offers weekly. And check this out. Once you play your first $5, they're going to give you $100 in bonus funds. And so you play 5, you get 100. It's that easy. And don't forget, Jake's been breaking down the best picks weekly in a show on Fridays, and links to join are in the description, and we look forward to playing with you this week. All right, let's turn the page to Tier 2. We have Kyron Williams, Javonte Williams, James Cook, Chase Brown, Travis Etienne Jr., DeAndre Swift, Quinshon Judkins, and Breece Hall. And at number 9, we've got Kyron Williams, and he's once again on pace for 1,400 total yards and 15 touchdowns again this year, and he scored at least 15 fantasy points in 5 of his last 6. Now he gets Tampa, who allows almost 23 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. At number 10, we have Javonte Williams, and the improvements to the Dallas defense is great for Williams. Hopefully, Dallas can hold leads, rely on their run game more, and then Williams can rack up touches. When he faced Philly back in week 1, he had 64 yards and 2 touchdowns. At number 11, we have James Cook, and Cook is on pace for a career high in total yardage. Over the past couple of weeks, we've seen a slight uptick in passing work, and this is a solid defense in Houston that he'll be facing, but he's produced in tough situations all year long. At number 12, we have Chase Brown, and he's now had over 100 total yards in 4 straight games. Still not a lot of touchdowns in the running game, though, and unfortunately, there's no team in the NFL that allows less fantasy points per game to running backs than the New England Patriots. At number 13, we have Travis Etienne Jr., and Etienne is now up to the RB12 on the season. He's had 3 straight games of at least 14 fantasy points, and now he has a matchup against Arizona, who allows the 9th most fantasy points per game to running backs. At 14, we have DeAndre Swift, and Swift has been one of the most consistent running backs for the majority of the season. He has 12-plus fantasy points in 5 of his last 6, and the Pittsburgh defense has been playing better, though, and so this is not going to be an easy matchup for him this week. At 15, we have Quinshon Judkins, and ever since injuring his shoulder 3 weeks ago, we've seen a big dip in production for Judkins. We could also be seeing Shedeur Sanders starting at quarterback this week against a Raiders defense that's been tough to run on. And at 16, we have Breece Hall, and the Jets have officially benched Justin Fields, and they're going with Tyrod Taylor. Tyrod is a more capable passer, but they're also limited weapons in New York, and so you have to think that Breece is still going to see 18-plus touches every week. All right, so that's Tier 2. Let's turn the page to Tier 3. We have Ashton Genty, Big Woody Marks, Aaron Jones, Jalen Warren, David Montgomery, Kenneth Walker III, and Alvin Kamara. At 17, we have Ashton Genty. And first, we had the rushing production and no passing work. Now we have the passing work and no rushing production. We just can't seem to get them both going at the same time. And now he gets Cleveland, who allows the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to running backs on the season. At 18, we have Big Woody Marks, and he's taken over the bulk of the backfield work. He now has 16-plus touches in back-to-back games, but he's now only averaging 3.5 yards per carry. Luckily, he gets another great matchup this week against Buffalo, who allows the 2nd most fantasy points per game to running backs. At number 19, we have Aaron Jones, and for the most part, Green Bay held Aaron Jones in check last season, and that was with a more competent quarterback. With the overall struggles in Minnesota with the offense, if he doesn't find the end zone this week, he might struggle inside of your fantasy lineup. At number 20, we have Jalen Warren, and reports are saying that the Steelers are optimistic that Warren will be able to play this week against Chicago. The matchup isn't horrible, but we're going to need to follow the practice reports to make sure that he's a full go by the weekend. At 21, we have David Montgomery, and this is a tough spot for Monty because he's actually playing pretty well, but his volume can just be so low at times because of Gibbs. This is a great matchup, though. The Giants allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to running backs. At number 22, we have Kenneth Walker III, and for sure, Kenneth Walker had one of his best games of the season on most people's benches in Week 11. And so is it sucking us in for disappointment? Because this week, he gets Tennessee, who allows the 7th most fantasy points per game to running backs. At number 23, we have Alvin Kamara, and let's start a fantasy prayer circle for a late season push from Alvin Kamara. He's coming off the bye in one of his best games of the season. With limited weapons and a great matchup against Atlanta, he has a chance at it in Week 12. All right, that's it for Tier 3. Let's turn the page to Tier 4. We have Emmanuel Wilson, Kareem Hunt, Sean Tucker, Bam Knight, Tyrone Tracy, Zach Charbonnet, and Kenneth Gainwell. At 24, we have Emmanuel Wilson, and word came out that Jacobs avoided major injury and will not need surgery. Whether or not he plays this week is still up in the air, and any limitations to Jacobs would mean increased volume to Wilson. If Jacobs plays, he slides into the top 15. At number 25, we have Kareem Hunt, and with or without Pacheco, Hunt has been one of the best running back options in Kansas City this season. He now has 4 touchdowns over his last 3 games, and in a Patrick Mahomes-led offense, you know he's going to get weekly touchdown opportunities. At number 26, we have Holy Sean Tucker. No one was surprised that he outproduced White, but 140 yards and 3 touchdowns. Bucky is still questionable, and this matchup is tougher against the Rams, so it will be hard to expect anything close to what we saw last week. At number 27, we have Bam Knight, and there's still no word for sure on Trey Benson, and Amari DeMarcado is questionable to play. That could leave Knight as the top back in Week 12 against Jacksonville. Unfortunately, they allow the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. At 28, we have Tyrone Tracy, and he's coming off a season high in touchdowns and yards. He had a massive 23 touches last week, and unfortunately, he's still in a split backfield, and now they get a tough matchup against one of the toughest run defenses in the NFL with the Detroit Lions. At 29, we have Zach Charbonnet, and obviously everybody is fed up with the Seattle backfield, but this is a great matchup going up against Cleveland, who allows the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and Charbonnet is still hovering right around 12 touches a week. At number 30, we have Kenneth Gainwell, and with Jaylen Warren potentially limited to an ankle injury, there is a chance that we see more Gainwell in Week 12. He produced well when called upon in Week 11, and this is a solid matchup for them going up against Chicago. So there you have it. That's your quick and dirty top 30 at the running back position in tiers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we've got a few guys on the outside looking in, and injuries that we're watching with Josh Jacobs, Rashad White, Tajay Spears, Tony Pollard, Kyle Monangai, Devin Singletary, Tyler Algier, and Jordan Mason. And that's the full running back board for Week 12. And let me know in the comments who feels too high, who feels too low, and which running back are you riding with this week. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and we'll keep you ready headed into the fantasy playoffs. Come on, Headliner Nation. Let's go get a win this week.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game.